Hello everybody, we're going to hit you up with another presidential election. This one, the election of 1932. We're in the middle of the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover going for the second term. Can he get it done? Let's find that out right now. Now we're going to start off with the incumbent party, and then it's the Republican Party. The incumbent, Herbert Hoover from California, elected in 1928, but really not a year into his term, he gets socked with the Great Depression. This leaves millions of Americans homeless, leaves millions of Americans out of work, and this leaves the American economy in the toilets. And 1932 is really rock bottom for the United States as far as the Great Depression is concerned. Unemployment's above 20% in 1932. But nonetheless, Herbert Hoover, President Hoover, wasn't really, he didn't really have any opposition to his renomination by the Republicans. The Republicans believed that Hoover's protectionism and aggressive fiscal policies would solve the Depression. And Hoover controlled the party, and he didn't have any trouble securing renomination. He did face some token opposition, so to speak, in Wisconsin Senator John J. Blaine, Joseph I. Franklin, Maryland, and James W. Wadsworth Jr. of New York. But Hoover really did not have any trouble in securing renomination, and the Republicans gave it to him. His vice president from Kansas, Charles Curtis, was renominated as vice president. Now that we have the Republican ticket of Hoover and Curtis, let's go to the Democrats. Now the Democrats, putting out their own slate of candidates for the nomination. They include the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the vice presidential nominee in 1920. The 1928 nominee, Al Smith of New York, and the Speaker of the House, John Nance Garner of Texas. Now, at the end of the day, it is going to be FDR who receives the Democratic nomination for president, and Speaker Garner will be nominated as his running mate. Now that we have the Republican ticket of Hoover and Curtis, and the Democratic ticket of FDR and Garner, let's put these guys into the ring and let's see who wins this thing. Now, FDR broke with tradition with how he accepted the Democratic nomination. He actually made the trip in person to the Democratic National Convention and accepted the nomination that way. In a speech, FDR promised to abolish useless offices and eliminate unnecessary functions of government, stating that government, federal and state and local costs too much, and even promised to help facilitate the restoration of the trade of the world. Roosevelt's trip to Chicago was the first of several successful precedent-making moves designed to make him appear to be the candidate of change in the election. Large crowds greeted Roosevelt as he traveled around the nation. His campaign slogan, "Happy Days Are Here Again," became one of the most popular in American political history, and indeed the unofficial anthem of the Democratic Party. Now, although Roosevelt was not as widely known as Smith had been in 1928, his utterances made him appealing to some of the same elements of the population that had supported Smith 4 years before. Moreover, the Democrats were united as they had not been in 1928, as Roosevelt's Protestantism was by no means detrimental as Smith's Roman Catholicism had been 4 years prior. The Democrats were also united closely, more so than they had been at any time in the fourth party system. Cultural issues that had dominated previous elections, like Catholicism in 1928 with Al Smith and the KKK in 1924, were nearly dormant, as the Depression seemed to be of greater concern among the American public. FDR, he managed to unite all wings of the Democratic Party by not talking about divisive cultural issues, and by bringing in a Southern conservative in John Nance Garner, the Speaker of the House, as his running mate. Now, Prohibition was a favorite Democratic target, as few Republicans tried to defend it. Remember, Hoover was the dry candidate. The Republicans were for Prohibition. The Democrats and FDR were for Prohibition. They were the wet candidates. Hoover and the Republicans, dry candidates, against Prohibition. And there was a mounting demand to end Prohibition and bring back beer, liquor, and the resulting tax revenues that came from it. Now, Prohibition would eventually end with the 21st Amendment to the Constitution. The 18th began Prohibition. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment by ending Prohibition. Now, in contrast, Hoover was not supported by many of the more prominent Republicans and violently opposed by others, in particular by a number of senators who had fought him throughout his administration and whose national reputation made their opposition of considerable importance. Many prominent Republicans even went so far as to espouse the cause of the Democratic candidate openly. Now, making matters worse for Hoover was the fact that many Americans blamed him for the Great Depression. Also, many Americans associated the Republican Party as a whole with the Great Depression big business. For more than 2 years, President Hoover had been restricting trade and increasing taxes on the wealthy with legislation such as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and the Revenue Act of 1932. Roosevelt lashed out at Hoover, saying, "I accuse the present administration of being the greatest spending administration in peacetime in all our history." Now, Speaker Garner accused Hoover of leading the country down the path of socialism. The outrage caused by the deaths of veterans in the Bonus Army incident in the summer of 1932, combined with the catastrophic economic effects of Hoover's domestic policies, reduced his chances of a second term from slim to none. And the Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans who marched on Washington demanding early payment of their World War I bonuses. These bonuses weren't due to be handed out until, I believe, 1945. But they wanted their bonuses now, and they camped in Washington before Hoover ordered the military to force them out. In his attempts to campaign in public were a disaster, as he often had objects thrown at him or his vehicle as he rode through city streets. In his addresses, Hoover attacked Roosevelt as a capitalist president who would only make the Depression worse by decreasing taxes, reducing government intervention in the economy, promoting trade with the world, and cutting government federal and state and local. However, with unemployment at 23.6%, Hoover's criticisms of Roosevelt's campaign promises did nothing more than further lower his popularity with the public. Roosevelt himself did not have a clear idea of the New Deal at this point. He promised a New Deal for the American people. He didn't say what programs are going to be in there, but he did promise a New Deal for the American people. So he promised no specific programs. It was said that even a vaguely talented dog catcher could have been elected president against the Republicans. Hoover even received a letter from an Illinois man that advised vote for Roosevelt and make it unanimous. And one last thing here before we get to the results. Hoover called Roosevelt a chameleon in plaid. And Roosevelt called President Hoover a fat, timid capon. In the last days of campaigning, Hoover criticized Roosevelt's nonsense tirades, glittering generalizations, ignorance, and defamation. So obviously the Great Depression, big issue in this election in 1932. And with the campaigning over, let's see who's going to win this thing right now. It is going to be a big landslide win for FDR and the Democrats. FDR is going to receive 472 electoral votes, while Herbert Hoover and the Republicans only received 59. 42 states vote for FDR and the Democrats, and the Solid South is swept by FDR. Remember, 4 years before, in 1928, because of Al Smith's Catholicism, Hoover and the Republicans almost carried the majority of the Solid South. But now Roosevelt's a Protestant, the South's united, and they're voting now for one candidate, and that is FDR. Hoover and the Republicans are only going to carry 6 states: Pennsylvania, Delaware, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. In terms of the popular vote, it's going to be 57.4% for FDR and the Democrats, 39.7% for Hoover and the Republicans. So Hoover coming in to the presidency with a big win, but leaving the presidency in a huge defeat. And FDR's win also signifies the end of the fourth party system. And by the time 1934 rolled around, the fifth party system was in full swing. The fifth party system would be dominated by FDR's New Deal coalition, would be dominated by Democrats, essentially. Really until 1968. Between 1932 and 1968, only one Republican would hold the White House, and that would be Dwight Eisenhower, elected in 1952 and 1956. Those videos will be coming in the coming days. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the election of 1932. I hope you got a lot out of it. Next time, we're going to get into the election of 1936 as we go through the Great Depression and head towards World War II. And if you haven't seen any of my previous videos, go ahead and watch those if you want. And with that, we will see you next time.